current estimates in terms of global estimates suggest, give or take, around 25% of the population may exhibit fatty liver. The evidence is pretty clear that the primary driver of the net accumulation of fat in the liver is energy excess. It's chronic energy excess. If the liver becomes fatty, the liver becomes insulin resistant. So you've got elevated glucose factors or hyperglycemic factors. You've got elevated insulin factors and elevated insulin resistance in the liver, all complicated by fatty liver. You've got this relationship with circulating lipids, non-esterified or free fatty acids, and elevated triglycerides, all kind of interacting, where the presence of fatty liver can drive the progression of type 2 diabetes.
In today's conversation, Dr. Alan Flanagan returns to talk to us about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In this episode, you will learn what non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is, who and how many people this condition affects, how our liver is involved in metabolic health, how we can optimize our lifestyle, including nutrition, to reduce our risk of developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or reverse it if we're already living with it, and plenty more. With that, please do enjoy. This is me and Alan Flanagan, PhD.
Dr. Alan Flanagan, here he is joining us for the 5th time. It's a pleasure to be doing this.
It's a pleasure to be back, albeit virtually. And this is what our 3rd attempt to get this particular episode off the ground. So,
yes.
Well, one could say we've suffered to get this happen, but
yes,
what even is suffering?
Quite a few technical difficulties, with a few laughs along the way. We've spoken a few times now about nutrition and how it relates to non-alcoholic fatty liver and metabolic health.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been on the phone or in person. So I thought it would be a good idea to try and condense a lot of that information related to this topic into a single resource for the listeners in this episode, to kind of set the stage for people so that they know exactly what we're talking about here. By definition, what is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease?
So the diagnosis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is when there is an accumulation of excess triglyceride or excess fat in over 5% of hepatocytes or liver cells. And for the non-alcoholic component of this particular condition, it's that the accumulation of that triglyceride is not related to excessive alcohol consumption, which, depending on the definition applied, is typically related to less than 20 grams of alcohol. So in that type of context, then it is an emphasis on more dietary and lifestyle factors, for which there are a number of non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors, as there are for any of these chronic and non-communicable conditions that we are particularly interested in for nutrition. But that's the general definition: net accumulation of excess triglycerides in over 5% of hepatocytes, which is not due to excessive alcohol consumption, with the threshold for alcohol typically set for this context at about 20 grams.
So hepatocytes equals liver cells, just to clarify that. I know
Yes.
you did there, but that's going to come up quite a lot in this episode, no doubt, just so that no one is confused there. So it's possible to develop fatty liver disease from excessive alcohol consumption. It's also possible to develop fatty liver disease through other lifestyle exposures. And then these are captured under this definition of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which, to my understanding, is the most common cause of chronic liver disease. And that's what we're focusing on today. So who is this disease affecting within our population, and approximately how common is it?
like you said, it is the most common form, and current estimates in terms of global estimates suggest, give or take, around 25% of the population may exhibit fatty liver. And there's a really high correlation within that with the overall metabolic syndrome, i.e., a constellation of cardiometabolic risk factors that are related to increased hepatic fat. So although that's a kind of average global estimate range, depending on the population, there are estimates that prevalence may range from, say, 12, 13% to up as high as 40%, depending on the specific population and subgroup you're looking at. As far as the risk factors that are related to NAFLD, in terms of non-modifiable risk factors, there are some sex dimorphic differences. So differences in terms of fat metabolism and fat accumulation, in terms of where fat accumulates in the body, the distribution of accumulated fat between males and females, that ultimately confer a higher risk on males. There are ethnicity differences where individuals from South and East Asian ancestry or Hispanic ancestry exhibit a higher prevalence of and greater risk for fatty liver compared to Black or African American ancestry, if we're looking at American data, or in the UK, for example, Black Caribbean ancestry compared to white Caucasian populations. So there is a kind of a clear divergence in risk related to ancestry or ethnicity as well. And then there are particular genetic variants. So all of these kind of non-modifiable factors can relate to risk. In terms of the modifiable factors, and much of this relates to the non-modifiable factors. For example, like I said, the reason that there are sex differences and even ethnicity differences in risk may relate to, for example, predisposition to visceral fat accumulation. So central adiposity and visceral fat accumulation, highly indicative of this kind of cardiometabolic risk profile that correlates with increased fat accumulation in the liver, inactivity, and of course diet. And within diet, there's a hierarchy, and we can obviously tease this out over the course of the episode, that generally relates to overall energy intake and excess. But then secondary to that, there are some really interesting aspects to this overall evidence base that relate to dietary composition, and of kind of most research interests, at least historically, was focused on components of added sugar, such as dietary fructose. More recently, an emphasis has shifted to look at the composition of dietary fat. And so within that, there's a kind of second level, in addition to total energy intake, there's a second level influence of macronutrient composition of the diet. And there is a relationship between that macronutrient composition and energy intake as well, such that even at levels of relatively maintenance energy or energy balance conditions, we can actually see differential effects of various macronutrient subtypes. So as far as that overall kind of picture of modifiable risk factor goes, diet and physical inactivity, because they are obviously then going to relate to central adiposity, visceral fat accumulation, and ultimately the accumulation of fat in the liver specifically.
Those differences between ethnicities and gender, I think you said males are more predisposed or have a higher risk of developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And you mentioned central adiposity. So something that's come up on this show, and I'm yet to sit down with Roy Taylor, is this idea of personal fat threshold. Is that kind of what we're talking about here? That different ethnicities and differences between males and females predisposes people to storing fat within and between organs versus other people with different backgrounds and different gender who have a greater capability of storing fat subcutaneously.
Yeah, the kind of under the hood factors that may be at play are interesting. As far as sex goes and differences between males and females, we have known for some time that there is this concept known as sex dimorphism, i.e., you have this distinction or divergent metabolic characteristics that relate to sex differences, primarily in sex steroid hormones. So we've known, for example, that there are differences in the distribution of adipose tissue and the type of adipose tissue between men and women. And we know that those sites of adipose tissue distribution correlate with different metabolic activity of that adipose tissue. So to kind of bring that into something concrete for listeners, under the influence of androgens, of male sex steroid hormones, there is a preferential distribution or uptake of fatty acids and their storage as triglycerides in central abdominal adipose tissue. That overall fat depot, we know, correlates typically with higher levels of inflammatory markers. It correlates with increased levels of fat in the liver. It's associated with the kind of inability to properly clear circulating fat. So you get this elevation in circulating free fatty acids or non-esterified fatty acids. So the liver is constantly trying to kind of deal with this, upregulating synthesis of very low density lipoprotein in the liver, and trying to kind of package triglycerides into that and exporting it. So this site of adipose tissue distribution around this kind of central abdominal region is associated with a number of adverse metabolic consequences. Conversely, particularly under the influence of estrogens, women, and especially in the premenopausal period, women exhibit a different profile of adipose tissue distribution that typically is more in the gluteal femoral region or the hips and thighs. Those typically are related to increased capacity to store fat in subcutaneous adipose tissue, to clear circulating fatty acids from the circulation. So there's not this constant circulating, increase in free fatty acids. As a result, then, lower triglycerides, lower VLDL levels, and overall improved lipid profile. And that fatty acid depot is very good at and efficient at uptaking fatty acids. It's associated with lower levels of inflammatory signaling, maintenance of insulin resistance, whereas in the central adiposity phenotypes, there's significant impacts on insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. So we have known that for some time. As it relates specifically to the accumulation of liver fat, there is evidence of sex-specific differences in hepatic fat oxidation. And a number of groups have demonstrated this using stable isotope tracer studies. So you're able to kind of very more accurately track the metabolic fate, so to speak, of fatty acids that have been administered.
Alan, just quickly, what does hepatic fat oxidation mean if someone's hearing that for the first time?
So the fancy, it is the fancy way of saying the utilization of fat in the liver. So that's actually something we really should kind of highlight. When fatty acids present to the liver, there are typically two primary fates, so to speak. One is esterification, and the other is known as beta oxidation or oxidation. So explain essentially what both of those really entail. Esterification is the fancy term for the creation of new triglyceride. Three fatty acids bound together with a glycerol backbone, right? The primary form of fat in the circulation other than free fatty acids. And of course, the primary form that we consume fat through our diets in. So esterification, listeners should think that's the process of creating new fat in the liver. Of course, that's going to be, important to this retention and accumulation of fat in the liver. And then beta oxidation is essentially the pathway of producing energy from fats in our diet, what we would colloquially term as burning fat, so to speak. And so within that pathway, you're talking about the actual utilization, the processing of fatty acids down the pathway of oxidation, is to say that those fatty acids are being utilized in the production of energy. And as a result, they're not being stored. So when we use the term hepatic fat oxidation, we're talking about the actual utilization of fatty acids for the production of energy in the liver, which means they're not, as a corollary, being stored in the liver. And we know from stable isotope tracer studies that there is a sex difference in the ability to oxidize, to utilize fatty acids, and that the liver's ability to do that is greater in women compared to men. Whereas men typically have a lower rate of utilization of fatty acids or oxidation of fatty acids, and potentially then obviously then have a greater partitioning of fatty acids into the other pathway, which is esterification and storage within the liver, which leads to this increase in the production of triglycerides and triglycerides in VLDL.
Can I throw a little bit of that back to you and just see if I've caught all of that? So there are some differences between genders and ethnicities that will predispose certain people to accumulating fat within the liver, and also increased triglyceride production in the liver. This is a problem for a few reasons, and I think we can unpack this. I'll throw a few things out and get you to elaborate on it. But one of these is that one of the liver's jobs is to produce glucose, and it distributes that through the body through circulation. That stops us becoming hypoglycemic. But my understanding is when we're accumulating fat within the liver, we are developing insulin resistance in the liver, and insulin's job at the liver is to sort of shut down or slow down that glucose production and glucose pouring into circulation. So as the liver fat concentration is increasing, you're losing that ability to sort of turn off glucose production, and the net effect over time can be an increase in blood glucose or less healthy blood glucose control. And then the other thing that you mentioned there is the liver is producing more triglycerides. They have to get packed into some type of vehicle to be transported. They're packed into these VLDLs, which are an ApoB containing lipoprotein. And if I'm kind of connecting a few dots here from my conversations with you previously and Thomas Dayspring, this can be a problem because the triglycerides, I believe, can increase the residence time of these VLDL lipoproteins, and you can get an increase in ApoB, which is then predisposing someone to cardiovascular disease. Does all of that sound accurate, or have I missed something there?
No, that is, and obviously you've introduced the glucose component now as well, which is of course important. So as the liver gets fatty, there are a number of metabolic and cardiovascular consequences of that. One is that we typically see in elevation in circulating non-esterified fatty acids, free fatty acids, that relates to insulin resistance in the liver, influences insulin resistance in the liver. There is obviously this upregulation of VLDL and triglyceride. And as the liver is becoming insulin resistant, the normal response to an individual consuming a meal containing carbohydrate is, if they were in the fasted state before that meal, the liver would be the primary site of glucose production and release to maintain, blood glucose levels within the normal ranges. And then to consume a meal in an otherwise healthy individual, there would be, via the action of insulin, a suppression of hepatic glucose, of liver glucose production and output, so that the body can deal with the now exogenous or dietary external source of glucose that has come in. Once the liver is insulin resistant, that process, part of the resistance to the signaling of insulin, is that suppression of liver glucose output is also impaired. So the liver continues to export glucose. And this is why this really is an overall clustering of cardiometabolic risk factors together that are all influencing the potential cardiovascular and metabolic consequences of fatty liver. So they're both of those components are important. And yes, the sex differences appear to relate primarily to this sex dimorphism in sex steroids and their respective influence of androgens and estrogens on the site, the distribution of adipose tissue, and the related metabolic functions of that adipose tissue. And then ethnicity differences may relate to a number of factors. There, for example, higher prevalence of certain genetic polymorphisms in, for example, Hispanic populations. There's also the fact that BMI, when we're looking at BMI, for example, the actual cutoff points differ relative to ethnicity as well. So, for example, if you're looking at a South Asian population, while typically we would define using BMI overweight as between, say, 25 to 30, and class 1 obesity as 30 and over to 35, that's actually lower in Asian populations. And so, for example, overweight would be classified as between 23.5 to 27.5, and class 1 obesity would be classified as over that 27.5. So if you were taking two people, one, if I'm in the UK, for example, I take someone from white British ancestry and someone from British Indian ancestry, and they both have a BMI of 27, that means different things for how we would interpret that relative to adipose tissue distribution. And that often may mean that there is risk present at BMI thresholds that if someone's not thinking about some of these ethnicity specific cutoffs, they could be missing that. And so in that context, for example, other metrics can be particularly useful here. waist circumference in particular, because you could have someone who, for all intents and purposes, has this quote normal BMI, but they may still have visceral fat accumulation and hepatic fat accumulation. And then, of course, related to that is components of diet as well. So they're the kind of broad brush difference or kind of factors influencing differences both between sex and between different ethnic backgrounds. But there's obviously some debate over whether some of those ethnicity specific cutoffs are even themselves a bit arbitrary. And there are some calls to refine further where the best kind of diagnostic cutoffs might be. But again, that's probably a conversation that's just slightly outside of scope for today's purposes.
So there are some people who are more susceptible to fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease than other people. And in particular, for a given BMI, you may have two people with the same BMI, but their distribution of fat is very different. One person may have much more fat viscerally between organs or ectopically inside organs, which is going to have much more severe metabolic consequences. And you just then added to that the importance of looking at waist circumference as another kind of diagnostic kind of window into someone's risk of fatty liver or developing a metabolic condition. If we are thinking about diagnosis here, presumably things like triglycerides and HbA1c, like what are the other things that might show up that might be an indicator that someone has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and how would this be sort of diagnosed clinically?
So as far as indicators go, risk factors go, there could be several, again, because we've mentioned this concept of clustering of cardiometabolic or metabolic syndrome risk factors. So elevated waist circumference, because that's highly indicative of visceral central abdominal adipose tissue accumulation. Elevated levels of triglycerides. When triglyceride is measured, generally it's a non-discriminatory. So although we will mention VLDL triglycerides a lot, I think, as we get more into the kind of the dietary factors influencing liver fat, when someone gets a measure of triglyceride, it is not specific to that. It's a non-specific measure of all triglycerides in the circulation, but that would be indicative of elevated fat in the liver. Also, something we've discussed before would be then matching that elevated level of triglyceride with other lipid parameters, such as low HDL. Of course, an adverse glucose tolerance test if an individual did actually have a glucose tolerance test. And all of this, taken together would be indicative of the potential for someone to have fatty liver. But as far as the actual diagnosis goes, typically this has been, and at least historically, something that was diagnosed through a liver biopsy, but they're quite invasive. And there are risks associated with undergoing a liver biopsy. So now there are two other non-invasive techniques that can be used. One of which is ultrasound, and the other of which is an MRI, or an MRS. And so those either ultrasound or imaging techniques, typically now as non-invasive alternatives to biopsy, can also be used as well to diagnose the presence of fatty liver.
Just to kind of backpedal a little bit, I wrote down a note here when you were talking about fat distribution, and you mentioned premenopausal women storing fat more so around the gluteal region, as opposed to abdominal fat like males of the same age. I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but my understanding is that fat distribution does change as a woman goes into perimenopause and then menopause. So is there any data out there as a woman sort of enters menopause, does the risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease go up?
Overall, the risk of cardiometabolic disease and cardiovascular disease in particular typically does shift related to the loss of ovarian estrogen production. And so in the postmenopausal period, the shift from ovarian estrogen production to primarily adipose tissue and adrenal gland estrogen production. And there's also, the shift to conversion of estrogen precursors as well. And so all of this kind of relates to a loss of that influence of estrogen on preferential partitioning of fat into subcutaneous depots, and then can relate consequently to a shift to more adipose tissue distributed in the central abdominal and visceral adipose tissue depots. So that is a shift that does occur. But there are even, for example, other in the premenopausal period as well, because we're talking about the potent influence of sex steroid hormones on sex dimorphism in this adipose tissue distribution, these differences. Women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, for example, who often exhibit high levels of androgens, may often then be characterized by greater central adiposity and related insulin resistance and cardiometabolic risk. So to answer your question, yes, but that shift, that's not necessarily only in women dichotomized by the pre versus postmenopausal period. It's also influenced even premenopausally by conditions like PCOS, which can be characterized by elevated androgens and androgen dominance. And so in that context, or certainly in the context of loss of ovarian estrogen production, there can be then this shift away from that kind of more protective preferential partitioning of fat from subcutaneous gluteal femoral or hips and thigh areas to more central abdominal and visceral adipose tissue distributions.
Have you seen any research? I know there's research looking at menopause and the use of estrogen hormone replacement therapy. Have there been any long-term interventions that have looked at women that are taking estrogen versus those that are not, and their risk of type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, some of these metabolic conditions that can relate back to fat distribution, which could be affected by sex hormone levels?
So I actually haven't seen any research looking, and this is not to say that research doesn't exist. I just haven't actually looked. So I'm not aware myself of any research that has looked at the impacts, for example, of HRT on fatty liver, either risk or even the influence of HRT on kind of visceral or fatty liver depots. So yeah, I'm not.
We can look that up.
Whether there is,
we can look that up, and
I think
if there is something, we'll put it into the show notes, and we can perhaps talk about it in a future episode.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
The kind of metabolic biomarkers that you mentioned before that could be kind of clues or might be little flags that are raised if you're reviewing blood work and signs that you might have excess fat in your liver, elevated triglycerides, HbA1c. You mentioned low HDL. These seem to be sort of downstream of the pathology, so more markers as opposed to makers, causally related to the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And earlier, I think you kind of underscored the fact that excessive calorie consumption and sedentary lifestyles are to a large degree driving the accumulation of fat in the liver. So I guess my question here, and this, I had Stefan Guine on the show and we were talking about type 2 diabetes, and he sort of defined it as a disease of energy toxicity. There's increased energy available. The body has to store that somewhere. If it cannot store it subcutaneously, where it is, I'm not sure if benign is the best way of describing it, but relatively benign, at least not as metabolically damaging. If it no longer has that capability, begins to store it in the liver, eventually in other organs like the pancreas. And he's probably referring to Roy Taylor's twin cycle hypothesis here. But is that what we're talking about here? Just to kind of clarify it, it's very similar to type 2 diabetes in that this is a disease of energy toxicity. And if overweight, obesity didn't exist in the numbers that it does today, would we see non-alcoholic fatty liver disease?
So there's probably two components to that question that are worth teasing apart. The first is, can we define this similarly as kind of energy toxicity? I think overall the evidence is pretty clear that the primary driver of the net accumulation of fat in the liver is energy excess. It's chronic energy excess. So in that context, it could share within that overall definition as Stephen Guine applied to type 2 diabetes, and indeed Roy Taylor's twin cycle hypothesis is positing something similar, where you have the continued accumulation of fat in the liver spilling over then to other important visceral organs, metabolic organs, and tissues, the pancreas in particular. Impairing the capacity of the beta cells to produce and secrete insulin and respond to and assist in the reduction of blood glucose levels. So could it be characterized in that way? I think the overall evidence would suggest it could. There are dietary factors then that can exacerbate or indeed attenuate the influence of energy at different levels, whether we're talking surplus or energy balance. We know, for example, if we're really stratifying evidence according to the level of energy, that hypocaloric interventions, almost irrespective of macronutrient composition, irrespective of type of diet, will reduce the level of fat in the liver. So in that context, that again, yes, it fits within this broad characterization that we have an effect of chronic excess energy intake that is, of course, going to be influenced by certain constituents at a macronutrient level of diet, but that overall then, in the broadest possible terms, hypocaloric interventions, the effect of net energy restriction and reduction will be to allow for the mobilization of stored fat in the liver, the utilization of that fat or oxidation, and the net reduction of the level of excess fat that is accumulated in cells in the liver. So I think that term is, overall something that could possibly be applied for a lot of the metabolic components of chronic lifestyle diseases or non-communicable diseases that we have. But I think so the second component of that, it is important, given what we've touched on, particularly with the ethnicity differences, but not even just related to that alone, to note that although the relationship overall between, say, for example, BMI and metabolic disease, and that includes both fatty liver and diabetes, is strong, the strength of that association is particularly notable at higher BMIs. But it's not a linear relationship entirely, particularly at BMI ranges that we might classify as quote unquote normal, or even just kind of the lower range of what we would classify as overweight. Particularly if we're talking about, Caucasian or non-Asian populations, where that would be, say, between 25 to 30. And those areas are gray because they're areas that are very prone to misclassify an individual relative to, for example, someone who has a greater proportion of lean body mass, like a very recreationally active athlete is going to have potentially proportionately greater lean body mass and lower fat mass, but could easily have a BMI of 28.
I think that's my BMI.
My BMI is 29.9. Like I'm nearly class 1 obese.
You've got more muscle than me, clearly. I'm 28 point something.
Okay, you need to eat more. But that is a real example of that limitation. I mean, but conversely, it could misclassify someone who. So in that context, neither of us are particularly high risk individuals, right? But it can misclassify someone who is a risk by virtue of missing more subtle markers that we're discussing. And the point I'm tying this back to is that individuals can still accumulate fat in the liver that it is relative to their body size, potentially not around the levels that we might currently diagnose fatty liver as, but still represents quite a high burden of triglyceride in the liver. And so there are these refinements there. And we've known this with type 2 diabetes risk, for example, that individuals within a normal range, when I say normal, I mean classified as normal weight according to BMI, 18.5 to 25, may still develop type 2 diabetes. And there are, of course, genetic factors at play there, but there are also some of these modifiable factors at play. And even a study we've discussed, recently is Roy Taylor's group's recent publication of the Retune study, which was looking specifically at the potential for kind of remission of type 2 diabetes to be achieved in individuals with type 2 diabetes, but whose BMI was in a range of 21 to 27. And what's fascinating, I think, as it relates to liver fat specifically in that study, is just so we're not veering too much into type 2 diabetes, although they're obviously highly correlated. What I thought was particularly interesting from the fatty liver component within that study is at baseline, these individuals either classified as, again, BMI of 21 to 27. So they're in the range of normal to, the very low end of what would be the overweight category for BMI. and their baseline liver fat levels were around 4%. So they wouldn't be meeting the current diagnostic threshold by a percentage, a percentage short. However, what was most instructive was that compared to BMI matched non-diabetic healthy controls, their levels of liver fat were 3 times greater than those healthy non-diabetic BMI matched controls. And of course, the liver then responded to the effects of the very low calorie liquid-based plus non-starchy vegetable dietary intervention that has been the hallmark intervention used in Taylor's research and the direct study and otherwise. And if I remember afterwards, I think it was around 2% post-intervention. So notwithstanding that these individuals are in this BMI range, there is still obviously, relative to their body size, a proportionately greater level of fat in the liver compared to non-diabetic healthy controls that is clearly influencing the overall pathophysiology of the condition. And of course, that's the primary hypothesis behind the Retune study, this idea of a personal fat threshold, whereby the underlying kind of pathophysiological influences on the metabolic impairment that characterizes type 2 diabetes are similar, such that the effect of an intervention like a low energy diet for a period of time will lead to the same outcomes. And ultimately, that study provides some early support for that hypothesis. What was interesting is just that the actual magnitudes required to achieve that differed because their overall body mass is obviously lower. So whereas the direct study has suggested that people starting from an obese BMI are going to require at a minimum 10% and probably more likely 15% of initial body weight loss. In this study, it was around 6.5% that was required to normalize HbA1c, with the corresponding reductions in liver fat and otherwise. So I think it is important to stress that while overall adiposity and higher BMIs, always correlate very strongly with the risk of and the presence of fatty liver and the risk of metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease, the actual risk is not only characterized by higher BMI, particularly if we're using that as a metric, and that individuals may accumulate, and develop the underlying pathologies related to metabolic disease at what would appear to be a quote normal BMI, but clearly under the hood, the actual metabolic effects are different relative to otherwise healthy controls.
So my understanding, at least when it comes to type 2 diabetes, is that about 5 out of 6 people with type 2 diabetes are in the kind of overweight or obese BMI classification, and then 1 out of 6 are considered normal, which was what Roy Taylor was looking at in that study. And I think part of the rationale, if I remember reading correctly, was that there had been some debate around, well, maybe people who are getting type 2 diabetes who are a quote unquote normal BMI, maybe the etiology, the cause of type 2 diabetes for those people is different, something else causing it. And therefore maybe the intervention is different. When I try and sort of reconcile all of this, and again, I appreciate we're talking about type 2 diabetes here, so we can then think about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease separately, even though they're very related. It's that shared commonality across all of these people that are developing type 2 diabetes anyway, regardless of what their BMI is the accumulation of too much fat inside or organs, between organs, fat where it shouldn't be. And for various reasons, that's occurring in some people who are what we would describe as a normal BMI. It's not the majority of people. And then for everyone else, it's occurring at higher BMIs, but common amongst all of them. And what seems to be driving the metabolic consequences is this fat that is finding its way into the wrong tissues. And Roy Taylor's most recent study kind of highlights that there's also a shared intervention, that if you can adopt a hypocaloric diet, hypocaloric meaning less calories than your body sort of requires to maintain its weight, and you can do that in a way where you are able to reduce your total body weight by enough such that you get the fat out of the wrong places, then you can begin to kind of unwind some of these metabolic derangements that are occurring. And in many people, if they haven't had that condition for too long, go into what's described as remission. Do you think that is similar for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, in that the majority of people that develop this are probably overweight or obese, but there could be a kind of lean phenotype, or a person who have normal BMI that gets non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and without having the study, I don't believe there's been a study looking specifically at this with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But do you think it's the same scenario where, regardless of that person's BMI, if they adopt a hypocaloric diet and lose enough body weight, they can get the fat out of the liver and reverse the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to the point where all of those biomarkers and diagnostics sort of return to normal levels?
Yes. I mean, I think what you're describing is an overarching commonality that may encapsulate the drivers of metabolic disease overall. And so it's almost at a level of principle that description is accurate. And obviously then the kind of specifics may differ, relative to what exactly we're talking about, between, say, for example, fatty liver versus type 2. But as an overarching unifying principle, that we have the excess accumulation of fat in the liver, driving hepatic insulin resistance, contributing to an increased concentration of circulating free fatty acids, particularly in the postprandial period, or in the period after a meal, therefore influencing new triglyceride synthesis, impairing the clearance of triglycerides in the postprandial period or post-meal period. And so, you mentioned that Guy and I used the term, energy toxicity. We have this term, lipotoxicity, which is really characterizing all of that as an umbrella term for all of those factors that I was just describing. This increase in flow of fats to other tissues, which then drives, the increased inflammatory profile of adipose tissue, if we're talking about these visceral depots, liver depots, immune responses, oxidative stress. And so this is potentially present in individuals at different levels of BMI, and would imply that the intervention, and we know from the body of available intervention evidence on hypocaloric diets, like we alluded to earlier, that macronutrient composition is secondary to the restriction of energy intake, will allow for that clearance. And we do know that there is, individuals can be characterized by fatty liver in the absence of a BMI in the obese categories range. So, to your point, does the similar proposition offered by the Retune study apply in the context of fatty liver? Overall, we would say, I think, from the body of evidence, that it does.
So how much overlap is there between non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes? And is it possible that someone is diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but they don't have type 2 diabetes because their pancreas is, able to sort of compensate and just produce more insulin, and they're able to kind of keep their blood glucose within the normal range despite the excess fat that has been accumulating in the liver and the insulin resistance there?
Yes. So it is possible that an individual have fatty liver without necessarily a diagnosis of type 2. So conditions can exist independently. But in terms of, I guess, the modern, because of course, type 2 diabetes can itself be influenced strongly by genetic risk factors, can occur at kind of normal weight, BMIs, etc. Both can exist independently, but in the context of what we're dealing with in the population now, with the abundance of excess energy, etc., the correlation between the two is particularly strong, and they may coexist. And the coexistence of fatty liver and type 2 diabetes is associated with an overall worse risk profile, metabolic profile, than simply having either alone. In terms of overall prevalence of the correlation, of the coexistence of the two conditions, there was a meta-analysis in 2017 that suggested, on average, the pooled prevalence was just about 60% in terms of the association between fatty liver and type 2 diabetes incidence. But the actual individual study estimates ranged and were, in some studies, I think the highest prevalence of the coexistence was 87% in one study. So, but again, the average prevalence in the analysis was about 60%. And if we're talking about the overall, we've been discussing a lot the kind of under the hood kind of mechanistic stuff here. It's unsurprising. We know, obviously, we've touched on this, but to kind of circle back to, I guess, re-emphasize and cement it in listeners' heads, if the liver becomes fatty, the liver becomes insulin resistance. That resistance to insulin then impairs the suppression of liver glucose production that would occur in an otherwise healthy individual that's just consumed a meal. So you get increased fasting glucose levels, you get elevated insulin levels. You've got, obviously, the exacerbation of overall insulin resistance and even skeletal muscle insulin sensitivity from continually elevated circulating fatty acids, and indeed the accumulation of intramyocellular, so the accumulation of fat in muscle cells, all influencing, the overall kind of state of insulin resistance. And then, of course, there is this lipotoxicity we mentioned briefly just there, where this excess accumulation of fat in the liver and in visceral organs starts to spill over. And this can include the pancreas, and the pancreas itself can start to increase its fat depots. And the consequence of this increase of fat in the cells of the pancreas is to impair the signaling pathways associated with with insulin function. The defective ability for insulin to and the beta cells to produce and release insulin, and so you get this progressive decline in the capacity of the beta cells to function, and that's the primary hallmark characteristic that predates a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So you've got elevated glucose factors or hyperglycemic factors. You've got elevated insulin factors and elevated insulin resistance in the liver, all complicated by fatty liver. You've got this relationship with circulating lipids, non-esterified or free fatty acids, and elevated triglycerides, all kind of interacting, where the presence of fatty liver can drive the progression of type 2 diabetes. And there are kind of little available pharmaceutical interventions that are specific to fatty liver. Some diabetic drugs can have kind of, it seems, effects, but really the capacity to exert a kind of reversal of the levels of fat in the liver to normal ranges is very much something that can be influenced by diet, of course, energy balance within that, and specific nutrients then secondary to energy balance, and physical activity as well.
Maybe Ozempic, topical at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sure there's researchers looking at that. When I think about type 2 diabetes and Roy Taylor's work, he's probably actually the scientist that's been mentioned the most on this podcast that's never been a guest. I do have him lined up to come on soon. I can promise everyone that. But one of the things that I found interesting in his work, my understanding anyway, is that if you have type 2 diabetes, the sooner you can develop a strategy, whether that is lifestyle or pharmaceutical or a combination of both, to get the fat out of the pancreas and the liver, the better, because you have a greater chance of remission. And it was, the subjects that found it more difficult to get into remission during the weight loss interventions often had type 2 diabetes for a decade or longer. And I believe the explanation or the hypothesis for what's happening there is that there just isn't the beta cell function anymore in the pancreas. The pancreas is just completely worn out. So even when you get the fat out of there, it's just unable to produce insulin. So it makes it very difficult for that person to come off glucose lowering medications, as opposed to someone else who's had type 2 diabetes for a much shorter period, get the fat out of the pancreas and the liver, and the beta cells function. There's enough beta cell function to produce enough insulin. They can come off glucose lowering medications. My question is about the immediacy and the importance of getting fat out of the liver if you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What happens to the liver? Because my understanding is that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is kind of like a first stage, but if this progresses over time, then it's not just these downstream metabolic consequences related to blood sugar and lipids, but also the liver itself begins to get damaged and scarred over time.
Yeah, so there are, I think we described at the outset, there's a spectrum of conditions that would fall under the umbrella of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD. And the first step, obviously, is what would be termed, the technical term, steatosis, which is this presence of excess accumulation of triglyceride in over 5% of hepatocytes, what we call fatty liver. That is a first reversible stage. Over time, that can progress to steatic hepatitis, which is still the presence of fatty liver, but the added now damage of inflammation, ballooning of the liver, fibrosis, scarring. And that potentially is also a reversible stage. Beyond that, the increasing progression across the spectrum is no longer reversible. So there's a progression from NASH to cirrhosis, progression potentially from cirrhosis to hepatocellular carcinoma. Both of those are very high risk conditions, which would require a liver transplant at that point. So you're correct to kind of identify the importance of when an individual finds themselves in that first stage of steatosis in isolation without the inflammation and ballooning and fibrosis, that it is, of course, important then to intervene. And that is the stage, of course, that is reversible with dietary intervention and lifestyle intervention. So it is particularly important because again, you're not just taking someone out of that kind of categorization or diagnosis of steatosis. You're also, by implication of the reduction of fat in the liver, reducing and improving all of these clustering of cardiometabolic risk factors that relate and are consequent on the accumulation of fat in the liver.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that then, and let's presume someone's been diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. They're under the care of their physician, and one of the things that the physician recommends is to lose weight. Sounds simple, right? But we know that it's much more complicated than that. And I know that you've looked over all of the research in this space, the various interventions and tools that are available that have been tried to help people lose weight. Where's your head at today if someone was to say to you, okay, I want to lose some weight. What are the intervention strategies that are available to me that I could think about, whether that's in isolation or combination of kind of different tools to help promote an energy deficit and help them lose sufficient weight to get their non-alcoholic fatty liver disease into what we would call remission or reversal?
Yeah, it's, starting again with the broadest possible recommendation, which is that we know that energy restriction, energy and achieving an energy deficit can have quite profound effects on reducing the amount of fat in the liver. There's reductions as a relative reduction in the level of fat in the liver of up to 45% could be potentially achieved with a weight loss of 7% of initial body weight. And so, at the broadest level, I think you would really be, trying to shift someone to thinking less about the type of diet necessarily that would allow them to do that, and more the type of diet they can particularly do, or they would be able to use to achieve that outcome, and focusing less on the actual kind of content of the diet. You don't typically see, much by way of difference in the potential reduction in liver fat from energy restricted diets between, say, for example, low carbohydrate and low fat diets, and that kind of manipulation over a longer term. That said, there is some interesting evidence of quite significant short-term effects of carbohydrate restriction. And some of these intervention trials, in as little as 1 week, have shown quite significant reductions in intrahepatic triglycerides, in the level of fat in the liver, over short-term periods. So there is that potential kind of nuance within the hypocaloric studies such that you can get an almost more immediate reduction in the level of fat in the liver in a very short term sense within a period of 1 week with carbohydrate restriction, and that over the longer term that effect is kind of no longer different. So that could be a strategy, but it's not one that would be required where someone to simply maintain their energy restricted diets over a longer period of time.
Okay, so the first point there that you made was you can reduce your liver fat by, this is relative terms, so you've got a starting amount of liver fat. You can reduce that liver fat by about 45% if you lose 7%, around 7% of your body weight. And if we're thinking about an 80 kilogram person, that's 5.5 kilograms, somewhere in that ballpark. And what you're saying is, rather than there being a definitive diet to point to, step one is for someone to kind of find some sort of approach that works for them in that they can adhere to it. And, you'll hear people talk about counting calories. That Roy Taylor is using the kind of very low calorie diet that you mentioned before, sort of meal replacement shakes, I think, which are about 600 calories a day. And then I think he says eat vegetables for the other 200 calories. So people are eating 800 calories a day for about 2 weeks up to a month. And then they go into a more of a kind of weight stability kind of phase where they eat healthfully, but more towards weight maintenance. And then they might repeat that, is my understanding, a few different times or a few cycles. But you've got counting calories. You've got, you could go low carb, like you just said then. There's low fat. There's, all of these different types of, I guess, dietary restriction where you're either changing the macronutrient contribution or you're removing food groups, pescatarian, vegetarian, plant-based. These are all kind of the same or different tools to achieve the same thing, which is some type of energy deficit. And then the other one that gets thrown up that I'd be interested to hear from you on is time-restricted eating. Do you think that has a place for certain people to help them consume less calories and get into a kind of hypocaloric state?
Potentially. I think, like most people, I found some of the early human interventions on time restricted eating to be interesting and potentially promising. That would have been in 2018. I think if we fast forward to 2023, I don't think that promise is necessarily there anymore. I don't think, when we move the hyperbole aside and we kind of forget some of the what remain more kind of speculative potential circadian mechanisms that might explain some of the time restricted eating effects, or were offered to. I just don't think there's anything that unique going on with time restricted eating. I don't think that the evidence supports almost any real benefit to an extended fasting period. I don't know that that's in. I think we've multiple interventions now in the last 2 years that have compared a time restricted eating protocol to general caloric restriction, energy restriction. There's almost no superiority demonstrated to the time restricted eating protocols. I think there still are some.
Do you think it needs to be superior for it to have utility? And I say that just thinking that people struggle to adhere with all sorts of things. So calorie restriction or counting calories adherence isn't going to be great. So it could be that at an individual level, it it acts as another option for someone who's not going well with counting calories to still, achieve the same kind of level. It might not be superior, but the same amount of weight loss simply by, restricting the time that they're eating.
Yeah, I think that's all we can say about it at this point. It is, if an individual finds that restricting the time every day in which they eat, whether they do that by, say, delaying their first meal by 90 minutes and bringing dinner forward by 90 minutes, however they decide to compress their eating period, if that is something that allows an individual to consume less calories, then that would be an effective strategy for that individual. But I don't think that there is any unique additional benefit that would be derived, in terms of achieving that. And again, we're talking about all of these options in the context of hypocaloric dieting, right? Restricting energy intake. If there's actually anything that does suggest a potential interesting effect, maybe additive to hypocaloric energy intake, it's the number of small interventions that have, well, that's more in the context of putting fat into the liver. No, there is some interesting research on very low carb ketogenic diets, and in the context of hypocaloric dieting, there was a paper by a group in Finland that do a huge amount of this research, which looked at like a 1,400 calorie a day diet, less than 25 grams per day carbohydrate, 64% fat. So it's a ketogenic dietary intervention, decreased liver fat by 31% in 6 days, body weight lowered by 3% in that time frame. And while this did reflect fat oxidation, so they used stable isotope tracers to understand that. So yes, there was this breakdown of the triglyceride in the liver, and this shuttling of those fatty acids into ketone production specifically. There's also a potential effect of this diet on liver volume because it really depletes liver glycogen levels. Now, do I think that that's a superior approach? Not really, because they're very short term. I think in someone who's particularly high risk, needs to get a lot of fat out of the liver quite quickly, that could be an approach. But I think those studies need to be replicated in larger sample sizes.
What's the control, Alan? There was there a control diet? I think you said 1,400 calories. Did they look at a 1,400 hypocaloric diet that had higher carbohydrates in that study?
No. There wasn't a control group. It was a direct intervention. So that's a limitation of the study. And when we do have some of the more head-to-head comparisons, there was another study that looked at around a 1,000 calorie a day diet, and compared a kind of low carb diet, 10% carbohydrate, 75% fat, and a low fat diet, 20% fat, 60% carbohydrate. Protein was the same, 15% to both. And they started the study with a kind of inpatient metabolic study, and then the participants were following the diets for 11 weeks. And what you saw was that the low carbohydrate intake decreased to a greater extent in the very immediate, kind of 48 hours of the metabolic inpatient study, but over 11 weeks.
Hepatic fat, decreased hepatic fat, yeah.
Decreased hepatic fat. But over 11 weeks, there was no difference between the diets. there was actually a slight trend toward, I don't like using that term, but there's a slight trend towards a greater reduction in the low fat group. But basically both groups had a relative reduction of liver fat of 50% over that 11 weeks. So I think when we think about the available evidence over those kind of longer term periods, while the short term studies are interesting and there could be a utility to them, it could be that, that they're used as this kind of immediate jolt before transitioning to a more, kind of balanced or mixed diet that might be more amenable to longer term real world adherence. Ultimately, it really does come back to the need to just create an energy deficit. In the context of, you've mentioned the type of dietary setup that Roy Taylor's group have used from Direct and now the Retune study. That doesn't aim for any specific, ketogenic or low fat composition, because it doesn't need to. The restriction on energy intake per se is the most fundamental component and the most important component to that dietary intervention. That's really where the weight of evidence would lie in the context of lowering fat out of the liver as well.
So when does it become important to think about dietary constituents? This is something else we've spoken a lot about offline, and there's a bunch of research looking at how different types of fat, because fat's an umbrella term. There are saturated fats, there are monounsaturated fats, there are polyunsaturated fats. Carbohydrates is an umbrella term, everything from a black bean to a jelly bean. When does it become important? So I appreciate what you've really underlined here is that the number one most important thing is creating an energy deficit, being in this hypocaloric state, losing sufficient weight to get enough fat out of the liver, to get the hepatic fat down to a level where it's not generating these downstream metabolic consequences. At what stage, if ever, and for who, does it become important then to not only think about the amount of calories that they're consuming and are they losing weight and getting towards that goal and below their personal fat threshold, but also to start thinking about the type of fat that they're consuming, the type of carbohydrates, and perhaps the amount. Is it a high carbohydrate diet, or are carbohydrates a problem and we need to be adopting a low carbohydrate diet?
So yeah, if the hypocaloric discussion we've just had relates to kind of how to get fat out of the liver, the question you're proposing is highly relevant for how fat gets into the liver in the first place. And there is this is probably where the most interesting elements of the nutrition and fatty liver research lie. So while yes, energy excess per se will influence the accumulation of fat in the liver, we have some really fascinating insights from overfeeding studies that would suggest that the magnitude of that increase in liver fat is influenced by dietary composition. So there's two component parts here that are probably of most interest. One is the role of dietary sugars, added sugars, or what are known as non-milk extrinsic sugars. We'll just call them added sugars. And then separately, then the role of dietary fat and fat composition between saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated. For quite some time, fructose specifically occupied a sort of pride of place in the research on, the effects of nutrition on increasing liver fat. Largely, that was based from free living studies that had participants consume quite high levels of added sugars in the form of, say, Coke. There's one study in particular that's quite instructive in this regard. It was a 2012 intervention from Maersk and colleagues. And basically they had participants in randomized to one of four groups, and they consumed 1 liter a day of a different drink in that group. 1 liter. One group consumed a liter of Coke, which is around 100 grams of sucrose, which is a mix of glucose, fructose. One group consumed a liter of milk, which contains milk sugars, around 40, so nearly 50 grams of milk sugars, 45 to 50. The third group consumed Diet Coke, so a liter, but 0 sugar, 0 calories. And the final group consumed a liter of water. And the group consuming the liter of Coke a day had a significant increase so their baseline levels of liver fat were 3.7% and finished at 5%. So they would have been diagnosed at that point with fatty liver from that intervention. Whereas the group consuming a liter of milk had a slight reduction, relative reduction in liver fat, as did the group consuming Diet Coke, as did the group consuming water, had minimal change. So removing the type of sugar, so that the milk versus Coke comparison gave us probably the most instructive finding from the study, which is that the type of sugar appeared to matter and the source of that sugar. And of course, the comparison between Coke, Diet Coke, and water also provided an additional insight, which is calories matter. So that led to a lot of focus on overfeeding or the potential role of sugar. But what's been particularly interesting, and that is a replicated finding, right? That the finding that added sugars in particular can increase liver fat when consumed in excess in the context of energy excess is a finding that is easily replicated
for both glucose and for fructose.
So that is itself the where things start to get interesting, right? Because this suggestion within this is fructose is potentially uniquely influencing liver fat. This is based on the kind of more unique mechanisms of fructose metabolism, which bypasses the steps related to the rate limiting step of glucose metabolism in the liver. So fructose bypasses the kind of pathway that glucose goes through in the liver, which results in a proportionately greater amount of fructose that's available for a process known as de novo lipogenesis, which is the synthesis of new fat from non-fat dietary substrates. In this case, sugar, carbohydrates. So we get this increase in triglyceride synthesis. And yes, absolutely, if you compare glucose to fructose, you will typically see a greater increase in de novo lipogenesis compared to glucose. But the question then begs whether there's actually a greater increase in liver fat accordingly. And one of the problems in some of this research has been the fact that they're in the context of energy excess. And in the context of energy excess, it's difficult to distinguish isolated effects of fructose, for example, versus glucose, because you've got the confounder of excess energy. But there's one particularly instructive study which was conducted by Johnston and colleagues 10 years ago, 2013 study. And this looked at participants consuming 25% of their energy from monosaccharide fructose, so isolated simple sugar fructose, compared to monosaccharide simple sugar glucose. But it had both energy balance phases and energy excess phases. This is in otherwise healthy participants. And during overfeeding, the energy excess condition, you had a similar increase in liver fat between both glucose and fructose. But neither of those increases were evident during the energy balance phase. And this is despite the fact that the actual dose of sugar remains the same. So at this point, and that study, there is other evidence, similarly corroborating the fact that if you overfeed fructose versus glucose by 600 calories, you won't see a different effect of the type of sugar. So what these studies suggest is that the increase in liver fat that occurs from added sugars is primarily a function of the excess energy. And this is particularly important because energy balance studies looking at the effect of diet composition and liver fat, when you actually take energy excess out of the equation, there is very little signal for an independent, isolated effect of added sugar absent the presence of energy excess. And there are multiple energy balance studies, isocaloric studies, that we can mention that support this contention. So I think just to kind of round that out, two main conclusions. There doesn't appear to be any more deleterious effect of fructose compared to glucose, and the effect of sugar primarily is in the context of excess energy and does not appear to increase liver fat independent of excess energy.
Hey friends, if you'd like to stay connected and reinforce the valuable insights from this show, let's connect on Instagram. You can find me at Simon Hill. That's at Simon Hill. I look forward to seeing you there. All right, let's dive back into the episode.
I think this will shock some people. Online there are a lot of comments, both on social media. I get them on YouTube where people are adamant that carbohydrates are responsible for fatty liver disease, for the accumulation of fat in the liver. But what you're saying, and I'm going to throw this back to you, is that if I'm consuming a eucaloric diet, so I'm consuming the exact number of calories that I'm expending per day, but I'm drinking a couple of cans of Coca-Cola, that the simple sugars that are added to those Coca-Cola drinks are not going to be driving up hepatic fat in my liver. I'm not going to be accumulating fat in my liver because I'm not consuming an excess of energy over the day.
So it could depend on the actual level of added sugars, but based on the available evidence that we have from isocaloric studies, one in particular, Parry and colleagues from Leanne Hodson's group at Oxford looked at two diets. One was a high simple sugar diet, 20% of energy from sugars. And the other was a high saturated fat diet, 20% of energy from saturated fat. And diets consumed for 4 weeks. And this is a crossover study. So all participants ate one diet, then had a 7-week break, washout period, then consumed the other diet. And what was particularly interesting was that liver fat increased by about 40% in the saturated fat group, but there was no change in an increase in liver fat in the 20% added sugar group.
That was eucaloric. So that was they were consuming the perfect amount of energy, the exact amount of energy that they were expending, such that they wouldn't be gaining weight.
So that was the intent. The diets were consumed free living. The sugar group didn't actually gain weight, so they had a 0.2 kilogram change in weight. So that would indicate, yes, they were in energy balance. The saturated fat group did in fact gain 1.5 kilos over that 4 weeks. So people might look at that and say, well, that explains the increase. But they did do a regression analysis to look at the association between weight gain and liver fat, to what extent that correlated. And the increase in body weight explained only 17% of the change in liver fat. So the majority of the increase in liver fat was attributable to the diet. And again, we can tie in multiple other studies looking at effects of saturated fat in the context of eucaloric or isocaloric intakes. So there are other effects of sugars. So high dietary sugar intake, can influence this process of de novo lipogenesis. That itself is mediated by the metabolic status of the individual. So in otherwise healthy individuals, the contribution of de novo lipogenesis to fatty acids in the liver is relatively low. It's like less than 5%. But in individuals who already have high levels of central adiposity, the contribution of de novo lipogenesis can be up to about 24%. But what's particularly interesting is that in energy balance studies, we can see an independent effect of saturated fat, and we can see the inverse effect of polyunsaturated fat enrichment, which can actually lower hepatic fat independent of kind of much change in body weight. But in terms of sugar, then we typically don't see independent effects of added sugars without the context of energy surplus. So if we're not talking about energy excess, then the composition of fats in the diet may be more relevant than the presence of sugar. And average population sugar intakes of 12% in the UK, at least. I'm not familiar with Australian data, but the numbers of people that would even be consuming the levels of sugar used in that study is 20%, for example. And there was also a paper published by the group at Surrey, Margot Umpleby and colleagues, that looked at the extremes of UK levels of habitual sugar intake. So either 24% would represent the upper 95th percentile of intake versus 2.5% in both individuals with NAFLD and non-NAFLD lean controls. And you see this modifying effect of response to high sugar intake relative to someone's existing metabolic health. So it's more deleterious in individuals that have high levels of liver fat.
Is that even in the context of energy balance? Are you saying that if someone has type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, within that context, can these sugars increase liver fat if they're not creating an energy surplus? Because what I heard earlier was you said if these sugars, simple sugars, are a problem, if they're increasing liver fat, it is done through the extent to which they increase calories beyond your requirement, to the extent that they're putting you into a calorie surplus, rather than being inherently problematic for liver fat accumulation, which is different to what you just said about fat types, which we'll come to. But are you, just to really clear something up, are you saying that if someone has a metabolic condition, metabolic disease, that this is a completely different context? So now in that context, any added sugars could be increasing liver fat levels, even if they're not in an energy surplus.
It's that they're having other impacts. So in that study that I mentioned, there was a comparison of both high versus low sugar diets, right? So the high sugar diet was 26% of energy from added sugar. The low sugar diet was 6% of energy from added sugars. And that included then the participants, men with fatty liver, with NAFLD, and then healthy controls with low levels of liver fat. And both diets were matched for total energy intake. And in the individuals with NAFLD, they ended up having a greater increase in VLDL triglyceride, right? This upregulation of VLDL triglyceride. They actually had that response to both levels of sugar. both the high and low sugar diet. But what was interesting about the effect of the high sugar diet is in participants, the healthy kind of low liver fat controls, their response, they did have an increase in VLDL, but it was the kind of larger VLDL1 particles. But the participants with fatty liver had a greater upregulation of the smaller, more atherogenic VLDL2, subparticles. So although there was this increase in elevation and elevated triglycerides, the actual composition of that, from a kind of atherogenic perspective, was different. And the reason for this potential, kind of increase and differential increase in kind of atherogenic VLDL is that those participants with NAFLD have a greater proportion of visceral adipose tissue overall. And this study was able to identify that the fatty acids that were derived from this, from these kind of visceral depot regions contributed more to VLDL triglycerides in the participants with fatty liver already. So the point here is that, and this is in the context of energy surplus as well. So the point I think that's important is, yes, of course, whether liver fat is increasing or decreasing is important, but as it relates to sugar, the idea that that's not necessarily the only impact that it could be having, particularly once individuals have visceral fat and the presence of fat in the liver, that high sugar intake would be impacting their risk profile in a negative way by, in this case, increasing atherogenic, VLDL2. But I think as far as trying to tie the sugar research together goes, it is very much based on current evidence tied to energy excess, and we typically don't see independent effects without energy excess, and we also typically see effects of sugar per se, not necessarily any monosaccharide subtype as between glucose or fructose.
Okay, but the story is slightly different when it comes to fats. So my understanding is that independent of energy, you mentioned before, and we've, I spoke to Richard Johnson on my show about this, and in preparation for that, I remember speaking to you a bunch of times, and you've also written about this quite extensively in one of your Sigma blogs or statements that goes through all of this research. We'll put that into the show notes, actually. That's a fantastic read. But my understanding is that when you swap calories, even if we're at energy balance, from saturated fat for polyunsaturated fats, we see a relative reduction in hepatic fat. Is that right? And perhaps you can kind of talk us through that body of literature and what the big takeaways are there.
Yeah, so we can even see that effect in the context of overfeeding. So if you compare saturated fat to sugar in the context of overfeeding, you can often see a greater increase in hepatic fat, in liver fat, from overfeeding saturated fat. And there's a really great paper, Luukkonen and colleagues, 2018, and that overfed people by 1,000 calories a day, and in one predominantly saturated fat in one group, unsaturated fat in another, and sugars in the other. And the increase in liver fat was 55% in the saturated fat group, 33% in the sugar group, and 15% in the unsaturated fat group. So that's already giving us a signal that there's a bit of a hierarchy of effect here. And so we've kind of dealt with the sugar component, but what we could clearly see here was that the there was an increase from overfeeding 1,000 calories a day of unsaturated fat, but clearly it was an effect that was attenuated relative to saturated fat in particular, and even relative to simple sugars. And there's another study that is instructive in this regard, because while the study I've just mentioned didn't necessarily differentiate between sources of unsaturated fat, it was a broad designation of unsaturated fat, mix of poly and monounsaturated fat. There was an intervention by Roskvist and colleagues, looked at a comparison between saturated fat enrichment, specifically kind of palmitate, and omega-6 linoleic acid enrichment. And this was deliberately designed to increase body weight by 3%. It was an overfeeding study. And what was fascinating was, after the 7 weeks of the intervention, both groups had actually gained the same amount of absolute weight. So the intended aim of the intervention was effective in this regard. They gained 1.6 kilograms, but liver fat increased 58% with the saturated fat enriched diet, whereas the increase was only about 5% on the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat diet. And body composition changed overall, not just in relation to liver fat. There was greater lean mass increases with the polyunsaturated linoleic acid enrichment, and the ratio of lean to fat mass increase. Now, that might, of course, beg the question from listeners: why? What potential mechanisms might be at play that relate to these differential effects? They relate, it appears, based on current evidence, to the degree of saturation of the fatty acids in the diet. Saturated fats have a number of potential mechanisms. The first is, in terms of the overall contribution of where fatty acids come from in order to get to the liver, there are a number of pathways when we're talking about dietary intake. But the majority of fatty acids in triglycerides in the liver and in VLDL come from the systemic circulation of non-esterified or free fatty acids. So this is important because one of the identified mechanisms of saturated fat is that it increases lipogenic pathways, the signaling for pathways that relate to lipolysis, the breakdown and release of stored fat into the systemic circulation. Saturated fatty acids stimulate lipogenic pathways. The second is that saturated fats, in terms of from dietary intake, the primary vehicle is the transport of triglycerides through chylomicrons. And chylomicron remnants, so these are leftover particles after triglycerides in chylomicrons have been broken down, that arrive at the liver with a delivery of triglycerides. And there are also spillover fatty acids from that. Now, there appears to be a degree of preferential oxidation of polyunsaturated fats compared to saturated fats. So there is, and this has been demonstrated in a number of stable isotope studies as well. So polyunsaturated fats appear to be preferentially oxidized compared to saturated fats, which are less prone to hydrolysis and oxidation. So there's a potentially greater delivery of dietary intake of saturated fatty acids to the liver. And then there's these compounds known as ceramides. So ceramides, when measured in the plasma, these are compounds that are derived from saturated fatty acids that, in fact, increase insulin resistance because they inhibit the transport of glucose into cells. So it's one mechanism by which saturated fatty acids impair insulin sensitivity. But one study looked at really, really interesting study, which looked at the respective contributions or impacts of saturated fat versus omega-6 polyunsaturated fats on plasma ceramide levels. And because these are derived from saturated fatty acids, during polyunsaturated fat enrichment, all of these ceramides decreased across the boards. But when saturated fat was enriched in the diet, total ceramide levels increased and each specific class of ceramide increased. But what was interesting was this was a study that achieved saturated fat overfeeding with enrichment with palmitate, which is a 16-carbon saturated fatty acid. And after adjusting for 16-carbon ceramides, there was no longer any significant association between diet and liver fat. So the kind of effect of that adjustment would indicate to us that the increase in liver fat was directly associated with the increase in 16-carbon derived saturated fatty acid ceramide from the saturated fat overfeeding. So there's a number of these pathways that appear to influence the differential metabolic fates of saturated compared to polyunsaturated fats, such that even in the context of overfeeding, there is a somewhat protective effect of polyunsaturated fat enrichment and preferential effects on body composition versus the deleterious effects of saturated fat overfeeding. And fascinatingly, everything that I've just described there occurs, or the evidence that we currently have demonstrates that this also occurs in the context of relative energy balance. So without an energy surplus, this appears to be the case. And we have evidence from isocaloric studies, eucaloric studies of this effect of saturated fat. Although the direct comparisons with polyunsaturated fat, for the most part, are in the context of overfeeding. But nevertheless, that seems to be that there is a differential effect of fat on the liver relative to the degree of saturation of the fatty acids, such that overall polyunsaturated fats exert a protective effect while saturated fats exert a negative effect.
Okay, that was a beautiful summary of a large body of research. I've got 2 or 3 things that I want to kind of say to that. And I might play devil's advocate a little bit here, because I imagine you said polyunsaturated fats are preferentially oxidized. And I think a number of people will hear that and they see oxidation as a negative thing, and they'll talk about oxidized LDL. Is the preferential oxidation of polyunsaturated fats anything to fear for any reason?
No, we're talking about kind of beta oxidation. We're talking about the utilization of fatty acids. We're not talking about oxidative stress, so to speak. And so, yeah, I understand that's a really important clarification, because unfortunately that term has kind of been hijacked somewhat, particularly in the kind of ongoing attempts to portray polyunsaturated fats and linoleic acid as kind of uniquely, deleterious for human health. No, we're talking here about the actual utilization of these fatty acids in a positive sense. And so a really good example of this is the fact that if you look at, and you compare polyunsaturated fats to saturated fats, you'll typically see lower levels of triglyceride with polyunsaturated fats. And that relates to the fact that it's primarily lower levels of chylomicron and VLDL triglycerides, because there is this preferential expression of lipoprotein lipase, the enzyme that's responsible for breaking down the triglyceride that's stored in these lipoproteins and these chylomicrons, liberating them as free fatty acids, and then tissues like skeletal muscle utilizing those free fatty acids in the production of energy. And so those pathways are related to the utilization of fatty acids, such that they're not either hanging around in the circulation or in this context being delivered to the liver and creating a burden that requires their storage in the liver. So these effects that we're describing here are positive effects of polyunsaturated fats in the postprandial period.
Okay, so preferential oxidation of polyunsaturated fats, a positive thing. The second thing that I wanted to ask you was more about the robustness of this body of literature. I think certain people, Dr. Peter Attia comes to mind, and I don't want to put words into his mouth, but generally speaking, I don't think he's convinced that there is a whole lot of benefit up for grabs for substituting the type of fats that you're consuming. And he seems to think that most, maybe not all, but most of how nutrition affects our health comes down to the total number of calories that we're consuming. And we've spoken here about the importance of energy balance and getting into a hypocaloric state if we're trying to get liver fat down. How, relatively speaking, how important is this substitution of saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat in the grand scheme of things if we're thinking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, what's driving it, and typical diets that people are consuming today?
Yeah, I think it just depends. I don't think there's a broad brush answer to that necessarily, because if an individual is consuming a high level of saturated fat, then the evidence that we have clearly indicates that that would be something that should be modified and would be potentially contributing to increased liver fat levels, for example, even without necessarily much of an energy excess. So and this is similar to a lot of the kind of claims that we typically see out of the fitness industry, related to kind of calories and energy. And it just creates somewhat of a straw man for me. Does total energy intake matter? Is it overall the most deterministic factor? Yes. That doesn't mean that dietary composition is not relevant. It's contextual, and clearly in the research with specific regard to fatty liver and the available evidence from dietary interventions, many of them very well conducted, and with direct head-to-head comparisons of different levels of fatty acids, or indeed fat versus sugar, but at the same level of energy intake, clearly does indicate an effective diet composition that's relative to energy balance. So the idea that it's one or the other is just a kind of an inappropriate dichotomizing. And I think when those kind of statements arise that kind of, well, this doesn't matter because total energy, I think it fundamentally just misunderstands the nature of diet and nutrition as an exposure, because total energy, whatever that level of energy is comprised of a dietary composition. They're not inseparable. They're part of an overall whole. So, of course, the given importance is going to depend on the specific context of an individual that we're talking about, across a range of factors: their metabolic health, their dietary composition on average, etc., baseline, and all of these things. So yeah, I don't think they're necessarily indivisible. You're dividing one factor by the sum of its parts, essentially.
This is a bit of a hypothetical question. It's hypothetical, I guess, because I doubt there's a study that has looked at this. At least I haven't seen it. But let's say someone is eating a very low carbohydrate, let's say carnivore diet. There's a lot of saturated fat in this diet that they're consuming, much more than the average diet. Let's say they're eating, a lot of fatty meat, butter, all the things. However, they're losing weight. Would their liver fat still likely be going down, just not as much if they were in the same energy deficit and eating a diet with less saturated fat? Or is it possible that even in a hypocaloric state that their liver fat could be going up?
I doubt that. we don't obviously have that evidence that would necessarily has looked directly at the effects of very high saturated fat intake in the context of an energy deficit. But what we know about the overall impacts of an energy deficit is that energy must, of course, be compensated for. And so in that context, I would imagine that there remains some degree of net oxidation of saturated fatty acids, such that you're not necessarily, and bear in mind that diet is also either totally absent or very restricted in carbohydrates. So fat is the only substrate available for energy production primarily. So I think it would be very difficult to say mechanistically why liver fat would increase in the context of a restricted energy diet. But of course, that would be the only thing in that context that would be saving them, so to speak, would be the fact that they're in an energy deficit, again, relative to everything else that we know.
So thinking about this, the relative importance of swapping calories from saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat, does it become more important in the context of the person that is one of those people with the lower BMI? They actually don't have a whole lot of sort of total body fat to lose. Is that where zooming in on the type of fat becomes more important? Here I'm speaking just to liver fat, because I appreciate that substitution, obviously it affects ApoB, and there's many other reasons why someone may want to make that. But if we're thinking about this liver fat pathology, is that the context where dietary substitution becomes more important, when that person cannot get into a hypercaloric diet or as deep of a deficit for as long?
Yeah, I think so. Like if you take an individual, for example, who struggles to lose weight, has a history of repeated dieting, has a history of rebound dieting, then it's not appropriate to just tell them to go and suck it up, and it's not ethical to go and tell them to suck it up. And this kind of tough love crap we see in the fitness industry just doesn't apply. So what does someone like that do? Certainly the evidence that we do have from these energy balance studies would indicate that attention to diet composition would be potentially impactful, particularly if their baseline diet, if we're talking about someone average kind of Western diet sitting at between 12 to 15% saturated fat and maybe 7 or less polyunsaturated fat percent, then there are immediate substitutions in that context that could actually have a positive impact on their overall postprandial metabolic health, and of course potentially reduce the level of fat in the liver. And that again would be suggested by the evidence that we have. So that would, I think it would, of course, depend on baseline composition. I think to kind of flip that, if we had someone consuming, 7% saturated fat and 12% polyunsaturated fat at energy balance conditions, and had the presence of, I doubt that they would have got themselves to the point of having the presence of fat in the liver. But let's say that they, had a diet beforehand that kind of progressed them to that point. They made these changes. There's still a degree of excess fat accumulation in the liver, but they're reluctant to lose weight. If all of the dietary manipulations and substitutions are already made, then it would be difficult to see how they could potentially get that fat out of the liver without some degree of energy restriction. But again, what would be important there would be to try and work with that individual to find a strategy that could allow them to to achieve that. And it may not necessarily be the linear context. And I do remember when Danny interviewed Roy Taylor a few years ago, and it's really stuck with me, that the point that he made was that precisely the reason, although it sounds aggressive, right? 600 calorie a day diet, it's precisely because it's so short term. From a behavioral standpoint, you're telling someone, do this for this really short defined period of time, put your head down, and just focus on getting, and people seem to be more amenable to that in many respects. But look, I think it's difficult. There comes a point where we can have all of the evidence and advice, and at some point, it may just not necessarily always be as applicable.
And we're going to finish this soon with some of the non-nutrition kind of lifestyle changes as well that someone may want to think about. But I'm conscious we've been speaking a lot about saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, rather than food. So just to kind of tie all of this together from a dietary pattern, food perspective, what does this look like if we're putting forward some sort of way of eating, dietary pattern that is good for the liver?
Funnily, a lot of those overfeeding studies used muffins that were specifically enriched with saturated or polyunsaturated fats. So people could buy muffins and drown them in sunflower oil and eat them. No, I think, the nice thing about nutrition a lot of the times is once you kind of get out of all of this more kind of zoomed in focus that we've been discussing and you build it back up, the advice ultimately is the same. It really is, just comes back to, from a food-based perspective in terms of fat composition, plant and marine based unsaturated fats, lower levels of animal and saturated fats, and the predominant food sources, of course, beef and meat and butter and those kind of foods, replaced with a plant oil like a olive oil or a rapeseed oil, or nuts, seeds, marine omega-3s if people consume that, algal based if they don't. So those kind of recommendations we've got are becoming pretty uniform. And obviously from a carbohydrate perspective, an emphasis on whole grains, legumes, certain, tubers, etc., in lieu of refined or processed carbohydrates. The actual food-based advice becomes relatively generic after a while, and obviously it's individuals can kind of tinker with it in terms of their own tastes and preferences and culture and region and all of that kind of jazz. But actually, the universality of the characteristics of a healthy diet mean that there are many food-based means by which someone can achieve those nutritional characteristics.
Yeah, I think people are often looking for something new, Alan. It gets a bit boring just coming back to the guidelines.
It really does. It really does.
I was hoping for something new, elaborate, controversial.
Yeah,
I didn't get it. Have you seen
it's
the
when
Danish?
You realize it's when you realize that, so you're just like, it's like, is there any point to continuing?
we really
entire field.
This could have been a 5-minute episode.
This is it. Yeah.
So have you seen the Danish guidelines, the nutrition guidelines?
I don't think I have.
I'll put them in the show notes. I think you'd really like them. They not only have amazing imagery, I think the best imagery, but pretty sensible guidelines. And basically I printed it out because I thought this might come up, and it's, people will say, oh, of course Simon likes these, but they are supported by the evidence. So deal with it. No, they've got 7 points. I'll just quickly read these off. So eat plant rich, varied and not too much. They kind of took that from Michael Pollan, I think. Number 2, eat more vegetables and fruit. Number 3, eat less meat. Choose legumes and fish. Number 4, eat whole grain foods. Number 5, choose vegetable oils and low-fat dairy products. I might get you to comment on the low-fat dairy products. Number 6, eat less sweet, salty, and fatty food. And number 7, are you thirsty? Drink water. They seem like a pretty sensible set of guidelines. How are you feeling these days with regards to people that are consuming dairy, low fat versus full fat? Because I understand there's a little bit of mixed research out there.
Yeah, like we know, and we've discussed this at length in our previous episodes. There are differences, although we have mentioned saturated fats as a class today. We know that there are differential effects of saturated fatty acids, the type of fatty acids that are comprised in a given food. And in terms of potential positive associations, as in beneficial associations with certain dairy foods that would otherwise be classified as high saturated fat, overall, that's really confined to cheese and yogurt, or kind of fermented yogurt drinks. So I don't know. I've thought a lot about whether, well, because some people would advocate public health guidelines need to change. They continue to recommend low fat products. I don't know that they do. I did think that, but I don't think necessarily that they do anymore. Primarily because, the distinction or the differentiation in terms of overall outcomes, whether we're talking about type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, other than specific recommendations for cheese, milk, for example, that overall body of evidence would suggest that a low fat version might be preferable for population health. I'm not talking about individual health here necessarily. So I don't think that they're at the level of public health guidelines. I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong per se. Where I think that I still see those guidelines as potentially, and where there are some valid points raised, is that by just generally specifying low fat, that can obviously lead people out to buy some sugar-laden flavored, kind of yogurt drink or whatever, low protein kind of. That's not really what the ideal outcome in that scenario is, and I think there can be clarity in that regard. But yeah, I think when we really parse the food-based relationships within the overall complex category that is dairy, because we can differentiate it on a number of different categorizations, whether related to fat content, processing level, churning or otherwise, all this kind of stuff. I don't think that there's a specific recommendation. I think you could refine those guidelines and say dairy, but if like, i.e., give some recommendations as far as portion sizes, because the associations with cheese are like between 30 to 60 grams a day. It's modest intakes. You're not eating the whole wheel of brie, so I think there could be some scope for some of the nuance within that research to be communicated better, but I understand conceptually why public health recommendations still broadly just state, low fat options.
Yeah, the Eat Lancet guidelines they're not national dietary guidelines, but they do sort of quantify the different food groups to an extent. There's kind of like a range in there. An average and like an upper and lower bound. Last nutrition question here. Yesterday, you quickly mentioned to me that meal frequency, there was some interesting research looking at meal frequency and liver fat.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of, in the context of overfeeding. There was a quite an interesting study, and again, it does relate not just to overfeeding, but also fat composition, diet composition, that might be relevant for our kind of current food environments. So this was a 6 weeks overfeeding intervention that compared a 40% excess of energy intake with a high fat, high sugar combination or high sugar alone. And then they looked at that as a kind of lower meal frequency or kind of higher meal frequency. So one of the interventions, for example, was the additional high fat, high sugar, 40% excess of energy, which was increased meal size. So they consumed their high fat, high sugar meal replacement when they consumed 3 main meals of the day. And then they did the exact same for the just sugar alone. But then they also got them to take the same amount of excess high fat, high sugar, or just high sugar alone, and now have it as a snack between their 3 main meals. So you had the same total amount of energy and the same composition of the overfeeding, albeit one consumed as like 3 main meals and the other consumed as snacks between meals, essentially. And what was really interesting was that there was this 45% increase in liver fat over the 6 weeks, which was where it was consumed all as part of the 3 main meals. And that was in the high fat, high sugar group. And there was a similar, there was quite a significant increase as well in the high sugar group. But that was greater in the frequency diets, the indicated, like as in the high frequency diets when they were consuming it as snacks between meals. And what was interesting was that the exact same level of sugar and fat had very little effect when it was consumed as just the 3 main meals of the day. So that's an interesting study. There's not a huge body of evidence around it, but it suggests that, again, in the context of overfeeding, the kind of frequency by which substrate is being delivered to the liver could be relevant as a factor, and that could be important for, again, for the environmental kind of drivers of our current diets, where people are kind of in a postprandial state for huge proportions of the day, constantly eating. Potentially that could be a factor, but again, I think we'd need some kind of further research to really tease apart that effect. And it would be interesting to see some of those isocaloric or energy balance studies that have looked at diet composition manipulations. It would be interesting to see them in the context of this frequency question.
I think I've put a plan together in my mind based on this conversation. Should I ever develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, at least the approach that I would go with. I actually had a DEXA scan. I know not as reliable as an MRI, but I had a DEXA scan, and fortunately my visceral fat anyway that it measured was 0.1 pounds. So it was basically zero, which the guy was very impressed with. So I'm bragging a little bit there. It's all the tofu. But if I developed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease based on this conversation, I would be, number one, trying to adopt some type of hypocaloric diet, and it might actually be a low carb version based on some of that research that you shared, but I would probably try and do that with a bias towards polyunsaturated fats. I might even look at time restricted eating, simply because I know that it tends to result in myself consuming less calories over a day, and maybe I would let go of the snacks, or just not snack as frequently. But that's one possible strategy of many based on the things that we've spoken about. What else outside of these sorts of things, the amount of calories that we're consuming, the type of fats that we're eating, etc. Outside of nutrition, are there any other aspects of someone's lifestyle that could be contributing to liver fat accumulation?
Sedentary behavior could, because obviously we need to utilize substrate, the kind of fatty acids and carbohydrate in our storage and circulation, glycogen. So yeah, physical activity, and there does appear to be some interesting research on resistance training potentially, and aerobic training. It may be splitting hairs. I don't know anything about kind of exercise research, so Drew might be good to kind of ask on that. But I would kind of, in my peripheral eyesight, be familiar with the kind of overarching fact that exercise positively influences kind of overall visceral fat accumulation.
Have you seen any research looking at sleep? I saw one study. It was a short randomized controlled trial that somehow convinced people to come in and only have 4 hours of sleep for, I think, 2 weeks every night. And then they did another period where they had 9 hours. And this is probably driven by energy consumption. But during that phase where they were sleep deprived, these people were consuming more calories, like 300 and something calories more a day, and their visceral fat went up. Is that anything that you've looked at?
I actually haven't directly looked at any. I've looked at sleep research generally as it relates to metabolic health, body composition, but I've actually never looked specifically as it relates to liver fat.
Well, this has been extremely comprehensive, Alan. You're very, very well read in this area, so we appreciate you coming on and sharing this with all of us. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on today that we missed, or you wanted to add before we wrap things up?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of ground, covered a lot of geeky detail as usual.
We did. I'm starting to now question who's the real liver king. Is it Alan Flanagan?
I may merely be the pancreatic prince. Right. I don't think I could ever take the crown of his hepatic highness.
Where can people find you, contact you? Where can they learn about Alinea and all the things that you're doing there?
Yeah, so that's primarily, where you'll find me in the kind of most accessible sense would be on Instagram at the Nutritional Advocate. Links to Alinea Nutrition there, which is our kind of education hub and research review for nutrition and healthcare professionals, people interested in the science in this area, and of course with Mr. Danny Lennon on Sigma Nutrition podcasts. And we also have the series of Sigma Statements, one of which is, of course, a big kind of long form essay on fatty liver and the evidence around that. So I think people listening to this episode might find a very helpful additional resource in that Sigma statement.
For sure. We'll put all that into the show notes. And I definitely, I recommend Alinea, but I highly recommend following Alan on Instagram and getting around his stories, particularly Friday nights, Saturday nights. There's some pretty humorous content that pops up after about 10 p.m.
That's it. Yeah.
And probably a few beers.
After a few pints, I have some thoughts.
Thank you, my friend. We appreciate you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.